The carriage wheels cracked against the frozen road, and Edmund Vale, Duke of Ashcombe, felt the world he knew break apart with them. Only 3 days earlier, he had been the most respected man in 3 counties. Now he sat alone in a cold carriage, his hands shaking, his name whispered in every drawing-room in London like a curse. He had been called into the study of his own solicitor that morning and told, in a flat and careful voice, that his signature was on papers he had never signed, debts he had never taken, promises he had never made, and somehow every document looked exactly like his handwriting, exactly like his seal, exactly like his ruin. "The Bank of Fenwick and Hart will not extend you another day," the solicitor had said, not meeting his eyes. "Nor will Lord Carrington. Nor will any house in London, your grace. I am sorry." Edmund had not shouted. He had not argued. He had simply nodded, the way a man nods when the ground beneath him gives way, and there is nothing left to hold onto but silence. By evening, the news had reached every corner of society. The Duke of Ashcombe was ruined. Some said he had gambled away his fortune in secret. Others whispered that he had signed false papers to hide a scandal even worse than debt. No one asked him for the truth. No one wanted the truth. They only wanted a story, and disgrace made the best story of all. His own cousin, Gerald Vale, had been the first to visit him that night, dressed in fine black, his face arranged into an expression of sorrowful concern that did not reach his eyes. "Cousin," Gerald had said, taking a seat without being asked, "this is a terrible business, terrible, but you must understand people will talk, they always do. I have tried to defend you where I can." Edmund had watched him carefully, some old instinct stirring beneath the shock. Gerald had always smiled too easily, agreed too quickly, and appeared too conveniently whenever trouble found the family. But grief and confusion made a poor detective, and Edmund had no strength left that night to question anything. "Thank you, Gerald," he had said quietly, and his cousin had smiled and poured them both a drink, and Edmund had not noticed the small, satisfied flicker in his cousin's eyes as the fire crackled between them. Within a week, the great house on Charlotte Street, the one that had belonged to the Vale family for 4 generations, was sold to cover debts that were not truly his. His servants were let go, one by one, with letters of reference he wrote himself, his hand steady even as his heart was not. His friends, the men who had dined at his table and ridden beside him at the hunt, stopped answering his letters. Invitations that once arrived daily now arrived not at all. He walked into his club one evening and felt the room grow quiet, felt every eye turn toward him and then away, as though looking at him too long might catch him like a disease. A young woman he had once considered marrying, the daughter of an earl, sent back his letters unopened, with a short note attached that read only, "My father says it would not be wise to continue our acquaintance." Edmund had stood in his nearly empty study, staring at that short sentence, and something inside him had gone very still and very cold. He had spent his whole life believing that a good name meant something, that honor was a thing a man carried inside himself and could not lose no matter what happened around him. He learned in that single week that this was not entirely true. A name could be stolen. Honor could be buried under enough whispers that no one bothered to dig it out again. He left London before the month was through, taking only what little remained to him. A small property, forgotten and half falling apart, sat on the edge of a quiet village called Millbrook, some 2 days' journey from the city. It had belonged to his grandmother, a modest stone house with an overgrown garden and a roof that leaked in 3 places. No one in society even remembered it existed. That suited Edmund perfectly. He wanted to disappear, and Millbrook was exactly the kind of place a man could vanish into. The journey there felt endless. He watched the fields roll past the carriage window, gray and bare under a sky heavy with winter clouds, and he tried not to think about what he had lost. It was easier to watch the land than to look inward, where everything felt like broken glass. When he finally arrived, the house looked even smaller and sadder than he remembered. Ivy had swallowed half the front wall. The garden gate hung from a single hinge. He stood in the cold, staring up at the crumbling stone, and for the first time since the scandal broke, he allowed himself one long, shuddering breath, the kind a man takes when no one is there to see him lose his composure. He had no servants to greet him, no fires already lit, no warm meal waiting. He had to light his own hearth with hands that had never once in his life needed to do such a thing. The smoke stung his eyes as he knelt before the fireplace, striking flint clumsily, failing twice before a small flame finally caught. He sat back on his heels and watched it grow, and he thought, with a strange and bitter clarity, that this small stubborn fire was the first thing in weeks that had not disappointed him. Word of a stranger moving into the old Vale cottage spread through Millbrook within a single day. Villages like this one thrived on news, and a mysterious gentleman arriving without servants, without warning, and without explanation was the most exciting thing to happen there in years. By the second morning, half the village already knew who he was. A traveling merchant, passing through on his way to the coast, mentioned overhearing talk in London about the ruined Duke of Ashcombe, and the pieces fell together quickly. Within hours, the story had grown legs of its own, the way stories always do in small places with little else to talk about. Some said he had cheated honest men out of their fortunes. Others said far worse. By the time the tale had passed through every cottage and every shop along the high street, Edmund Vale was no longer a man with a complicated and painful history. He was simply the disgraced Duke, and Millbrook decided almost immediately that it wanted nothing to do with him. He felt it the very first time he walked into the village to buy bread and candles. Conversations stopped as he passed. Mothers pulled their children a little closer. The baker, a broad man named Walter Cobb, served him without a single word, refusing even to meet his eyes, and gave him his change so quickly that 2 coins fell to the floor rather than into Edmund's open palm. Edmund knelt to collect them himself, feeling the heat of embarrassment climb up his neck, aware of every pair of eyes watching him from the corners of the shop. He walked home with his small parcel of bread, his boots crunching over the frost-covered lane, and told himself it did not matter. He had not come to Millbrook to make friends. He had come to disappear, and disappearing, it seemed, was something the village was more than willing to help him do. Days passed in this manner, quiet and gray and long. He spent his mornings trying to repair what he could of the house, his hands blistering on tools he had never before needed to use. He spent his afternoons walking the empty fields behind the cottage, his thoughts circling endlessly back to the study in London, to Gerald's too careful sympathy, to the solicitor who would not meet his eyes. Something about the whole affair sat wrong in his chest, a splinter he could not quite reach, but grief made it hard to think clearly, and he pushed the feeling down each time it rose. It was on the 7th day, during a storm that rolled in suddenly from the west, that everything in Edmund's careful, lonely existence changed. He had gone out that afternoon on the only horse he still owned, a tired gray mare far past her prime, meaning only to look at the eastern boundary of the small property before the weather turned. But the sky darkened faster than he expected, and rain began to fall in heavy, freezing sheets, and the mare, startled by a sudden crack of thunder, reared without warning and threw him hard onto the muddy road. Pain exploded through his shoulder and the side of his head as he struck the ground. For a moment the world tilted and blurred, rain hammering down into his eyes, the horse bolting away into the gray distance, and Edmund lay there in the mud on the empty road, alone, injured, and utterly unable to stand. He tried twice to push himself up and failed both times, his vision swimming, his shoulder screaming with every movement. The rain soaked through his coat within seconds, and the cold began to bite at him with a viciousness that frightened him more than the fall itself. He thought with a strange, detached clarity that this was perhaps how it would end. Not with scandal or ruin, but here, in the mud, in a village that did not even know his true name, forgotten by everyone he had once called friend. It was then that he heard footsteps, fast and light, splashing through the puddles toward him, and a voice, clear and unafraid, cutting through the roar of the storm. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" He turned his head, rain stinging his eyes, and saw a young woman kneeling beside him in the mud without the slightest hesitation, her bonnet already soaked through, her cloak plastered to her shoulders. She could not have been older than 23, with warm brown eyes that held none of the fear or judgment he had grown so used to seeing in the faces of Millbrook. "Do not try to move yet," she said firmly, pressing a steady hand against his good shoulder. Tell me where the pain is worst. My shoulder, he managed, his voice rough, and my head, I think. She nodded once, businesslike despite the storm raging around them, and looked quickly toward the tree line, calculating something in her mind. There is a barn not far from here. Can you stand if I help you? I do not wish to trouble you, he said, even as another wave of pain rolled through him. You should not be out in this weather for a stranger. She looked at him then, and something in her expression was almost amused, despite the circumstances. A man is lying injured in the road in the middle of a storm, and you are lecturing me on manners. Put your arm around my shoulders, sir. We can argue about propriety once you are dry. There was no time to argue further. With her help and no small amount of effort, Edmund managed to rise unsteadily to his feet, leaning heavily against her slight frame as she guided him, step by careful step, through the rain toward a weathered barn at the edge of a nearby field. She did not once complain about the weight, nor about the rain, nor about the mud now soaking the hem of her dress. She simply kept walking, murmuring small words of encouragement, until they finally reached the shelter of the barn and the storm's roar softened into a steady drumming on the roof above them. She helped him settle onto a bale of hay and immediately set to work, tearing a strip of clean cloth from her petticoat without a moment's hesitation, and pressing it gently against the cut above his brow. You are fortunate, she said, examining the wound with a calm efficiency that surprised him. It looks worse than it is. Head wounds always bleed a great deal, even the small ones. Does your shoulder move at all? He tried, wincing sharply. A little. Not far. Then it is likely not broken, only wrenched badly. You will feel it for some days, I am afraid, but you should heal well enough. She tied the cloth carefully, her fingers quick and sure, and only then did she seem to truly look at his face, as though noticing him properly for the first time. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition, and Edmund felt his stomach tighten, certain the warmth in her manner was about to vanish the moment she realized who he was. You are the gentleman who has taken the old Vale cottage, she said slowly. It was not quite a question. He held her gaze, bracing himself for the coldness he had come to expect from every person in Millbrook. I am Edmund Vale, formerly the Duke of Ashcombe, though I imagine you have already heard what that title is worth these days. He waited for her to withdraw her hand, to grow distant, perhaps even to leave him there in the barn as the villagers might have wished. Instead, she simply reached for another strip of cloth and continued her work, her expression unchanged. I have heard a great many things, she said evenly. I have also learned that the things people say loudest in a village are very rarely the things that are true. My name is Eleanor Hartley. My father is the vicar here. Edmund stared at her, rain still dripping from his hair, his shoulder throbbing, and felt something strange move through his chest, something he had not felt since the disaster in London had swallowed his life whole. It took him a long moment to recognize what it was. It was relief, not because his shoulder had been tended, though he was grateful for that. It was relief at being looked at, spoken to, and touched by another human being who did not flinch at his name. You do not seem afraid of me, Miss Hartley, he said quietly, though I am told most of Millbrook is. Eleanor tied off the last strip of cloth and sat back on her heels, studying him with an expression that was neither pity nor judgment, but something steadier than either. I do not believe fear is owed to a man simply because others have decided to be afraid of him, she said. I prefer to make up my own mind about people, sir. It has served me rather well so far. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small shelter of that old barn, Edmund Vale felt, for the first time in weeks, that perhaps he was not entirely alone in the world after all. They remained in the barn far longer than either of them expected, waiting for the worst of the storm to pass. Eleanor found an old horse blanket hanging from a nail and wrapped it around his shoulders without asking, and Edmund found himself, despite the pain and the cold, unable to look away from her as she moved about the small space, checking the door, peering out at the rain, entirely unbothered by the strangeness of the situation. "You are very calm," he observed. "For a woman tending to a stranger the whole village believes to be a criminal." "My father says calmness is simply practice wearing a different coat," she replied, settling onto a bale of hay a respectful distance from him. "I have tended broken bones, birthed lambs in worse weather than this, and once pulled Mr. Cobb the baker out of the mill pond when he had too much cider at the harvest fair. A gentleman with a bruised shoulder does not fright me terribly." Despite himself, Edmund felt the corner of his mouth lift, the first genuine smile to cross his face in longer than he could remember. "I am glad to know I rank somewhere below a drunken baker in difficulty." "Only just below," she said, and there was warmth in her voice now, something almost like teasing, and it struck Edmund with unexpected force how long it had been since anyone had spoken to him without caution or contempt. When the rain finally softened to a drizzle, Alina helped him rise and guided him slowly back toward the road, refusing his repeated insistence that he could manage alone. "You can barely stand without leaning on that fence post," she said briskly. "I will see you to your door, and you will not argue with me further, sir. I have found that stubborn men heal more slowly." He did not argue further, both because the pain in his shoulder made walking difficult, and because, if he was honest with himself, he did not wish for her company to end so soon. They walked together along the muddy lane, the fields glistening under the retreating clouds, and for a time neither of them spoke. It was Alina who finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" "You may ask, though I would ask that you not call me that. I have found the title brings little but trouble these days." She glanced at him, something searching in her expression. "Very well, Mr. Vale, then. I have heard the stories in the village about debts and false papers and disgrace. I do not ask you to explain yourself to me, for I am owed no such explanation. But I confess I am curious. Do you believe the things they say of you are true?" It was the first time anyone had asked him so plainly, without accusation, without pity, simply a question offered honestly and awaiting an honest answer. Edmund stopped walking, and Alina stopped beside him, waiting patiently as the last of the rain dripped from the hedgerows around them. "No," he said finally, the word coming out rougher than he intended. "I do not believe the papers were mine, though I cannot yet prove it. I do not know how my signature came to be on documents I never signed, nor how debts I never took came to bear my name. I only know that within the space of a single week, I lost everything I had built my life upon, and no one, not one person among all those I once called friends, thought to ask me whether it was true before they turned away." Alina was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those steady brown eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice held none of the doubt he had braced himself to hear. "Then it seems to me," she said, "that Millbrook is simply making the same mistake London already made. I do not intend to make it as well." They reached the crooked gate of his cottage a short while later, and Alina helped him settle onto the small bench beside the door before stepping back, her cloak still damp, her bonnet ruined by the rain. "Rest that shoulder," she instructed. "Do not attempt to ride again for at least a week, and keep the wound above your brow clean. I will send my father's remedy for the bruising, if you will accept it." "You have already done far more than I deserve, Miss Hartley," Edmund said quietly. "I am not certain how to thank you properly." Alina considered this for a moment, and something gentle passed across her face, something that looked almost like sadness on his behalf. "You need not thank me, Mr. Vale. You have simply reminded me of something I already believed but had perhaps begun to forget in the comfort of easy village life. A person's worth is not decided by the crowd around them. It is decided by what remains true of them when the crowd has gone." She turned then and walked back down the lane toward the village, her figure growing smaller against the gray evening sky, and Edmund Vale sat alone on the bench outside his crumbling cottage, his shoulder aching, his head still ringing faintly from the fall, and felt, for the first time since his world had collapsed around him, something dangerously close to hope. He did not yet know that this single storm, and the woman who had knelt beside him in the mud without fear, would change the entire course of what remained of his life. He did not know that Millbrook, which had so quickly condemned him, would soon turn its sharp tongue toward her as well. And he certainly did not know that far away in London, his cousin Gerald Vale was already receiving reports of his location, smiling quietly to himself as he folded the letter and reached for pen and paper to begin planning his next move. For now, Edmund simply sat in the cold evening air, watching the last of the storm clear from the sky, and allowed himself, cautiously, to believe that not everyone in England had turned against him after all. 3 days after the storm, a knock sounded at Edmund's crooked front door, and he opened it to find Eleanor standing there with a small basket over her arm, her bonnet neatly tied, her expression businesslike in a way that almost made him smile. "My father's remedy for bruising," she said, stepping past him into the cottage before he could even offer an invitation. "Comfrey and arnica boiled down with a little vinegar. It smells dreadful, but it works. How is the shoulder?" "Improved," Edmund admitted, closing the door behind her, "though I confess I did not expect you to deliver it yourself. I did not trust anyone else in the village to carry it without asking a great many questions along the way," Eleanor said, setting the basket on his bare wooden table and glancing around the small, sparse room. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the empty shelves, the single chair, the cold hearth waiting to be lit. "You have very little here, Mr. Vale." "I have what remained after the debts were settled," he said simply. There was no bitterness in his voice, only plain fact, though something in his tone made Eleanor look at him a moment longer than necessary. "Sit," she said finally, nodding toward the chair. "Let me look at that cut above your brow before I go. I promised my father I would not linger, and village tongues wag quickly enough without giving them more to chew on." Edmund obeyed, settling into the chair as Eleanor examined the wound with the same careful efficiency she had shown in the barn. Her fingers were gentle but sure, and Edmund found himself watching her face rather than thinking about the pain, noting the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the quiet hum she made when satisfied with what she saw. "It is healing well," she said, stepping back. "You will have a small scar, I think, but nothing to trouble you." "A scar seems a fitting souvenir," Edmund said dryly, "for a man who has collected so many other kinds of ruin this year." Eleanor tilted her head, studying him. "You speak of your misfortune as though it were a joke, Mr. Vale. I do not think you find it funny at all." He looked away, toward the cold hearth, and for a moment the easy warmth between them faded into something heavier. "No," he admitted. "I do not find it funny. I find it difficult to speak of it any other way without losing my composure entirely, and I have found that composure is the only thing left that no one has yet managed to take from me." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened. "You need not perform composure for my benefit. I did not come here to judge how you carry your grief." Something in her plain honesty struck him harder than any comfort dressed in polite phrases might have. He looked up at her, and for the first time since the disaster in London, he allowed the mask to slip, just slightly, just enough for her to see the exhaustion beneath it. "I keep turning it over in my mind," he said quietly. "How my own signature appeared on papers I never touched, how debts I never took came to bear my name so convincingly that even my own solicitor would not look me in the eye. I have asked myself every night whether I am losing my senses, whether perhaps I truly did sign something in a moment I cannot recall, but I know I did not. I know it as surely as I know my own name, and yet knowing it changes nothing, for the whole of London has already decided otherwise." Eleanor pulled the second chair from beside the empty hearth and sat across from him, her basket forgotten on the table. "Who benefited most from your ruin?" she asked simply. Edmund blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. Every disaster has a shape to it, Mr. Vale, and every shape points somewhere. If the papers were false, someone made them false, and that someone had a reason. Debts do not invent themselves." "Who stood to gain when your name was ruined?" He sat back slowly, the question settling into his mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples he had not allowed himself to follow before. "My cousin," he said slowly. "Gerald. He inherits the remaining Ashcombe properties should I be proven unfit to hold the title or should I die without an heir. He was the first to visit me after the news broke." He seemed sorrowful, but I remember now that he seemed sorrowful the way an actor seems sorrowful, as though he had rehearsed the expression beforehand. "And did he ever explain how he came to know the details of your ruin so quickly?" Alina pressed. "Before it was even public knowledge." Edmund's jaw tightened as the memory sharpened in his mind, the pieces he had been too grief-stricken to examine before now arranging themselves into a shape he did not like at all. He knew the exact sum of the debts before my own solicitor had finished explaining them to me. I thought nothing of it at the time. I was too shattered to think of anything at all. Alina watched him carefully, and there was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet, steady patience. "I am not accusing your cousin of anything, Mr. Vale, for I have never met the man and know nothing of his character. But grief has a way of closing a person's eyes to the very details that might set them free again. Perhaps it is worth opening them, now that some of the shock has passed." Edmund said nothing for a long while, staring at the cold hearth, his mind turning over months of memories he had been too wounded to examine properly. Alina did not press him further. She simply rose, gathered her basket, and moved toward the door, pausing only when her hand rested on the latch. "I must return before my father worries," she said. "But you are welcome to call at the vicarage should you wish to speak further, or should the shoulder trouble you again. My father is a reasonable man, whatever the village may say of the rest of us." "The rest of you?" Edmund asked, rising despite the twinge in his shoulder. Alina's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Millbrook has already begun to notice that the vicar's daughter walked home in a storm and returned 2 days later with a remedy for the disgraced duke. I do not imagine it will take them long to form an opinion about that as well." She left before he could respond, and Edmund stood alone in his small cottage for a long time after the door closed, turning over her words, both about his cousin and about herself, and feeling the first stirrings of a fear that had nothing to do with his own ruin at all. His fear proved well-founded. By the end of that week, whispers had begun to move through Millbrook like smoke through a chimney, quiet at first, then thickening into something that could not be ignored. Mrs. Winslow, who ran the village's only shop, was the first to speak the words aloud, standing outside her door with 2 other women, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "The vicar's daughter, mind you, walking out to that man's cottage as though it were nothing at all. What would her poor mother say, God rest her soul, to see Alina throwing away her good name on a criminal from London?" Alina heard the words herself as she passed with a basket of mending, and though her spine straightened and her chin lifted, she said nothing, only continued walking, her footsteps steady on the cobbled lane. But that evening, at the vicarage, her father set down his pipe and studied her with the quiet, careful expression of a man choosing his words with great deliberation. "Alina," Reverend Hartley said gently, "I do not doubt your judgment nor your kindness. I have never doubted either. But you must understand how this appears to a village that thrives on very little else besides its own gossip." "I understand perfectly well how it appears, father," Alina replied, setting her needlework aside. "It appears as though a woman showed simple Christian charity to an injured man, which is precisely what happened. I fail to see the scandal in that." "The scandal, my dear, is rarely in what actually happened," her father said, not unkindly. "It is in what people choose to believe happened. I have heard the stories about this Duke of Ashcombe as much as anyone. I do not know whether they are true. But I know that your reputation, once tarnished, does not mend as easily as a shoulder wound." Alina was quiet for a moment, staring into the small fire crackling in the hearth. "Would you have me leave a man bleeding in the road, father, because the village has already decided his character without evidence?" Reverend Hartley sighed, and something in his weathered face softened with a mixture of pride and worry that only a parent could carry at once. "No, my dear, I would not have you do that. I only ask that you tread carefully." The world is rarely kind to a woman who stands apart from its expectations, however right she may be to do so. Elinor said nothing more that evening, but she thought of her father's words often in the days that followed, weighing them each time she considered whether to walk the lane toward the old Vale cottage. And yet, despite every warning whispered around her, despite the sideways glances that followed her through the village now wherever she went, she found she could not simply turn away from the man she had found broken and alone in the rain. There was something in Edmund Vale's quiet dignity, in the careful way he held his grief without letting it curdle into bitterness, that she could not in good conscience abandon simply because Millbrook had decided to be cruel. Meanwhile, far away in London, in a study far grander than anything Edmund's small cottage could offer, Gerald Vale sat behind a wide mahogany desk, reading a letter that had arrived that morning from a man he paid well to watch his cousin's movements from a discreet distance. The letter informed him, in careful and deliberate language, that the former Duke of Ashcombe had settled quietly into Millbrook, that he had suffered a minor accident during a storm, and that he had been tended to and befriended by a young woman of the village, the daughter of the local vicar. Gerald read the letter twice, his expression unreadable, before setting it down beside a small stack of similar reports he had been collecting for weeks. He had expected his cousin to fade quietly into obscurity, to drink himself into irrelevance in some forgotten corner of England where no one would ever think to look at him twice. A friendship, however small, was not part of the plan. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the London street below, his mind working carefully through the implications. A man alone and friendless was easy to forget. A man with even one loyal companion might begin, in time, to rebuild something. And Gerald Vale had worked too hard, forged too many careful documents, called in too many quiet favors from men who owed him discretion, to allow his cousin even the smallest foothold toward recovery. He returned to his desk, drew out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write, his pen moving with the same careful precision that had, months earlier, produced a signature so perfectly matched to his cousin's own hand that not even Edmund himself had been able to say with certainty that he had not written it. The letter he composed that afternoon was addressed to an associate in the north, a man skilled in quiet persuasion and careful rumor, and it contained instructions that would, within a fortnight, begin to unravel whatever fragile peace Edmund Vale and Elinor Hartley had managed to build in the quiet corner of Millbrook. Gerald sealed the letter with the Ashcombe crest, a small, private smile touching the corner of his mouth, and rang for his servant to see it delivered by the fastest post available. Back in Millbrook, unaware of the storm quietly gathering against them from the city, Edmund spent his mornings slowly repairing his cottage and his afternoons, more often than not, finding some small reason to walk the lane toward the vicarage. He told himself each time that it was simply gratitude, simply the natural courtesy owed to a woman who had saved him from the cold and the mud. But as the days passed, and his shoulder healed and his conversations with Elinor grew longer and more unguarded, he began to understand that gratitude alone could not explain the way his chest tightened pleasantly each time he saw her walking toward him along the frost-covered lane, nor the quiet ache he felt on the days she was too occupied with parish duties to spare him more than a passing word. Elinor, for her part, found herself equally unable to explain the growing warmth she felt toward the man the village had so thoroughly condemned. She had tended many injuries in her years assisting her father throughout the parish, had shown kindness to a great many strangers passing through Millbrook, and yet none had lingered in her thoughts the way Edmund Vale did, with his quiet humor beneath the grief, his careful gratitude for even the smallest kindness, and the honesty with which he had finally begun to speak of his ruin, no longer performing composure for her benefit, but simply allowing her to see him as he truly was. It was on a clear afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the storm, that their growing friendship reached a turning point neither of them had fully anticipated. Edmund had walked into the village for supplies, his shoulder nearly healed, and had come upon Elinor near the churchyard, sitting alone on a low stone wall, her expression troubled in a way he had not seen before. "Miss Hartley," he said, approaching carefully, "is something amiss?" She looked up, and for a moment before she composed herself, he saw something raw in her eyes, something that looked almost like doubt. "It is nothing, Mr. Vale, simply village talk. I am not accustomed to being its subject, that is all." Edmund's stomach tightened with sudden understanding. "They are speaking of you, because of me." Elinor did not deny it, and her silence was answer enough. Edmund sat down beside her on the low wall, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to remain proper, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "I have brought you nothing but trouble," he said finally, his voice heavy with something close to shame. "You showed me kindness when the entire village would have left me in the mud, and in return I have cost you the good opinion of your neighbors." "You have cost me nothing that was worth having in the first place," Elinor said, more sharply than she intended, though her eyes remained gentle even as her tone hardened. "If my neighbor's good opinion depends entirely upon my abandoning a man in need, because his name has fallen out of fashion in London drawing rooms, then I do not think their good opinion is worth the trouble of keeping." "That is easy to say," Edmund said quietly, "and far harder to live, I imagine, in a village as small as this one, where every glance and every whispered word follows you home." Elinor turned to look at him fully then, and something steady and unshakable settled over her features, the same quiet strength he had first seen in her the moment she knelt beside him in the storm. "Mr. Vale, I have watched this village turn its back on a man before he was ever given the chance to defend himself. I will not compound that unkindness by turning my back on the one person who has shown me, in his own ruin, more honesty and more grace than half the families who have lived here for generations. Whatever the cost to my reputation, I find I would rather bear it than live with the alternative." Edmund stared at her, something tightening painfully in his chest, half gratitude and half something far more dangerous, something he did not yet dare to name. "I do not deserve such loyalty, Miss Hartley, not from a stranger who owes me nothing at all." "Perhaps not," Elinor said softly, rising from the wall and smoothing her skirts. "But I have never much cared for deserving, Mr. Vale. I care only for what is right, and I have decided quite plainly what that is." She left him sitting alone on the low stone wall as the afternoon light faded gently over the churchyard, and Edmund watched her go, his heart aching with a feeling he had not allowed himself in months, a feeling he was only beginning to understand might be the first true seed of hope in the wreckage of everything he had lost. He did not yet know that, hundreds of miles away, his cousin's letter had already reached its destination, and that the quiet peace he and Elinor had built together in Millbrook was about to be tested in ways far crueler than village gossip alone could manage. The stranger arrived in Millbrook on a gray Tuesday morning, riding a fine horse far too well groomed for a man claiming to be a simple traveling merchant. He called himself Mr. Pratt, and within an hour of taking a room at the village inn, he had already begun buying rounds of ale for anyone willing to sit and talk with him. He was a careful man, patient in his questions, never pressing too hard, always letting the local gossips do the work for him. By midday, he had learned the name of every family in Millbrook worth knowing, and by evening he had steered the conversation, gently and without seeming to try, toward the disgraced Duke living in the old Vale cottage. "A curious thing," Mr. Pratt said, leaning back in his chair at the inn, addressing no one in particular though every ear in the room was listening. "I have heard talk of this Duke of Ashcombe as far as Bristol. They say in London he did not merely fall into debt through misfortune. They say there were darker matters involved. Fraud against tenant farmers on his own estate. Papers forged not by others, mind you, but by the Duke himself, to hide moneys he had already spent on matters no gentleman ought to speak of in polite company." A murmur moved through the small crowd gathered at the inn that evening, and old Mr. Cobb the baker, already inclined to distrust the stranger from the cottage, leaned forward eagerly. "Is that so? We had heard only that he lost his fortune. Nothing of tenant farmers being wronged." "Oh, it is a sad business," Mr. Pratt said, shaking his head with theatrical sorrow, his ale untouched before him. "Families left with nothing, their savings gone, Also, a wealthy man could keep his fine coats and his fine carriages a little while longer. I only mention it because I understand he has settled here among you. I should hate to see good, honest people taken in by a man with such a history." By the following morning, the story had transformed and multiplied, as such stories always did, gathering new and darker details with every retelling until the whispers bore little resemblance to anything close to truth. Some said Edmund had stolen directly from widows. Others claimed he had fled London only steps ahead of the magistrate. A few, emboldened by drink and imagination, suggested things far worse, things that made even Mrs. Winslow, no stranger to gossip herself, lower her voice and glance nervously toward the church as though the very walls might carry such wicked talk straight to heaven's disapproving ear. Edmund felt the shift the moment he walked into the village that afternoon. Where before there had been simple avoidance, cold looks and turned backs, now there was something sharper, something closer to open hostility. A group of men outside the smithy fell silent as he passed, their eyes following him with open suspicion. A woman pulled her young son roughly by the arm and hurried him across the street rather than allow him to walk near Edmund's path. Even Walter Cobb, who had at least served him without incident before, now refused to sell him bread at all, claiming, with a stiff and unconvincing excuse, that his ovens had failed to rise properly that morning. Edmund walked home with empty hands and a heavy heart, uncertain what had changed so suddenly, though some deep instinct told him the shift was no accident. He learned the truth of it that evening, when Alina arrived at his door, her face pale with worry beneath her bonnet, her hands twisting anxiously in her cloak. "There is a man in the village," she said without preamble, stepping inside before he had fully opened the door. "A stranger calling himself Pratt. He has been telling stories, Mr. Vale, terrible stories, about tenant farmers robbed of their savings, about darker matters left unspoken. The whole village believes them already. I have never seen gossip spread so quickly, nor take root so deeply." Edmund's blood ran cold. "Tenant farmers," he repeated slowly. "I have wronged no tenant farmer in my life, Alina. My family's estates were managed honestly, whatever else may be said of my ruin." "I did not think otherwise," Alina said firmly. "But someone has taken great care to ensure that anyone hearing these stories would think otherwise. This is no accident, Mr. Vale. Someone has sent this man here deliberately, and I think we both know who benefits most from your name being dragged even further into the mud." Edmund sank into the chair by his cold hearth, his hands pressed against his face for a long moment before he finally looked up, something hard and resolved settling into his expression, a look Alina had not yet seen from him. "Gerald," he said quietly. "It must be Gerald. He learned somehow that I had begun to find some small peace here, and he means to take even that from me." "Then we must prove it," Alina said simply, as though the matter were as straightforward as mending a torn hem. "We must find some evidence of how the forged papers came to bear your signature, and some connection between your cousin and this man Pratt, who has come to poison the village against you." "We," Edmund repeated softly, looking at her with something between disbelief and gratitude. "Alina, you have already risked more for my sake than any sensible woman should. I cannot ask you to risk further, chasing evidence against a man with the resources and cunning to forge a duke's own signature without detection." "You are not asking," Alina said, lifting her chin in that familiar, stubborn way that Edmund had come to find utterly disarming. "I am offering. There is a difference, Mr. Vale, and I would ask you to respect it." Despite the gravity of the moment, Edmund felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward, some small, helpless warmth breaking through the fear settling in his chest. "You are a remarkable woman, Alina Hartley." "So I have been told," she said, though a faint color rose in her cheeks at the compliment. "Now tell me everything you remember about the weeks before the scandal broke. Every visitor, every letter, every strange request from your cousin or anyone connected to him. Somewhere in your memory lies the thread that will unravel this whole terrible business, if only we are patient enough to find it." They talked long into the evening, Edmund recounting details he had been too grief-stricken to examine closely before, Alina listening carefully, occasionally asking a sharp, precise question that sent his mind spinning back toward some forgotten detail. He remembered slowly a visit from Gerald some 6 weeks before the scandal, ostensibly a friendly call, during which his cousin had asked, in passing, about the location of certain family papers kept in the estate's private study. He remembered a locksmith Gerald had recommended for a broken cabinet, a man Edmund had never thought to question. He remembered with a growing chill that the very night before his solicitor first summoned him with news of the forged debts, Gerald had dined with him privately, and that his own household ledger, the one containing samples of his signature used for household accounts, had gone briefly missing from his study the following morning, only to reappear, seemingly untouched, 2 days later. "There," Alina said quietly once he had finished, "that is where it begins, I think, the ledger. If your cousin, or someone working for him, had access to your true signature for even a single night, a skilled forger could copy it convincingly enough to deceive a solicitor who saw you sign documents perhaps only twice a year." "But how would we ever prove such a thing?" Edmund asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "The ledger is gone, along with every other paper from that house. I have no proof beyond my own memory, and memory alone will not satisfy a magistrate, nor silence a village already convinced of my guilt." Alina was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, there was a careful determination in her voice that Edmund found himself trusting almost instinctively. "Then we must find someone who can look at those forged papers with a trained eye and tell us they are false. A man of law, perhaps, someone with no loyalty to your cousin, and no reason to fear the consequences of speaking an inconvenient truth." "There is a man," Edmund said slowly, memory stirring. "William Carow. We studied together at Cambridge many years ago. He practices law in Bristol now, a careful and honest man as far as I have ever known him. He owes me no particular loyalty, but neither does he owe anything to Gerald. If anyone might be willing to examine the matter fairly, it would be him." "Then write to him," Alina said at once, "tonight if you are able. The sooner we begin, the sooner this man Pratt's lies lose their power over Millbrook." Edmund rose and found paper and ink, his hand steadier than it had been in weeks as he began composing a careful letter to his old friend, explaining, as plainly as he could, the circumstances of his ruin and asking, humbly, whether Carow might be willing to examine the forged documents still held by the London solicitors who had first uncovered them. While he wrote, Alina moved quietly about the small cottage, straightening what little furniture there was, feeding the fire until it burned steady and warm, and Edmund found himself glancing up from his letter more than once simply to watch her, struck again by how naturally she had settled into his life, how easily she had made herself an ally in a fight that was not, by any measure, her own to fight. The letter was sent the following morning, carried by a boy from the village whom Alina trusted to deliver it discreetly, and then began the difficult work of waiting. The days that followed were among the hardest either of them had faced since the storm first brought them together. Mr. Pratt remained in Millbrook, his stories growing bolder with each passing evening at the inn, and the village's hostility toward Edmund deepened correspondingly. Someone threw a stone through the small window of his cottage one night, shattering the glass and scattering shards across his sparse belongings, though he never learned who had done it, nor did anyone come forward to admit the deed. He began to notice, with growing unease, that he was followed at a distance whenever he walked into the village, watched by unfriendly eyes that made even simple errands feel like walking into hostile territory. Alina fared little better. The whispers that had once merely questioned her judgment now grew sharper and crueler, some suggesting openly that she had been deceived by a clever criminal, others implying far worse motives for her continued loyalty. Her father, though he never once asked her to abandon Edmund, grew visibly more strained with worry each time she returned from the cottage, and Alina began to notice fewer greetings extended toward her in the market, fewer smiles from women she had known her whole life. It was during this difficult period, nearly a week after the letter had been sent, that Alina arrived at Edmund's cottage one evening in a state of barely contained distress, a folded paper clutched tightly in her hand. "They have called a meeting," she said, her voice tight with anger she was struggling to control. "The village elders, tomorrow evening at the church hall. They mean to discuss whether you ought to be permitted to remain in Millbrook at all, given the stories now circulating about your character." Edmund felt something cold settle deep in his chest. "They mean to drive me out." "They mean to try," Elinor said fiercely, "though I intend to speak against it, whatever it costs me to do so." "Elinor, no," Edmund said quickly, rising from his chair. "You have already sacrificed too much of your standing in this village on my behalf. If you stand against the elders publicly, you risk far more than gossip. You risk your father's position, your own future here. I cannot allow you to bear that burden for my sake." "You cannot allow it," Elinor repeated, something fierce and unwavering flashing in her eyes. "Mr. Vale, I have made my own choices since the moment I knelt beside you in that storm, and I will continue making them regardless of what you believe you can or cannot allow. I did not come here tonight to ask your permission. I came to tell you what is happening so that you are not caught unaware tomorrow evening." Edmund stared at her, torn between fear for what the meeting might mean for both their futures and a fierce, aching admiration for the courage with which she faced it. "Then I will attend as well," he said finally. "Whatever they intend to say of me, I would rather hear it spoken to my face than hide from it in this cottage, while my fate is decided without me." Elinor nodded, some of the tension easing from her shoulders now that the decision had been made. "Then we face it together tomorrow. And Edmund," she added, softer now, using his given name for the first time since they had met, "whatever is said in that hall, know that I do not regret a single moment of the choice I made in that storm." The word hung between them in the small cottage, warm despite the cold fear gathering around tomorrow's meeting, and Edmund felt something in his chest tighten painfully. A fragile hope he had not dared to name taking firmer root with every passing day he spent in her company. Neither of them slept well that night, each turning over in their minds every argument the village elders might raise, every accusation Mr. Pratt's carefully seeded lies had planted in Millbrook's collective imagination. But when morning came, and then the long, anxious hours of the afternoon, both Edmund and Elinor found themselves walking toward the church hall as evening fell, side by side, prepared to face together whatever judgment awaited them within. Neither of them yet knew that the meeting would prove far more dangerous than either had anticipated, nor that William Carrow's reply, already on its way from Bristol, carried within it the first true thread that might one day unravel Gerald Vale's carefully constructed lies entirely. The church hall was already crowded by the time Edmund and Elinor arrived, candlelight flickering against rows of wooden benches filled with familiar faces, every one of them turning to stare as the pair entered together. A low murmur rippled through the room, and Edmund felt the weight of dozens of unfriendly eyes settle upon him like a physical burden. At the front of the hall stood three men who together formed the informal council of Millbrook's affairs. The magistrate, a stern gray-haired man named Sir Joseph Pemberton, who oversaw matters of local law. The elder churchwarden, Mr. Alastair Finch, whose disapproval of Edmund had been evident from their very first meeting, and seated slightly apart, watching the proceedings with a carefully neutral expression that Edmund did not trust for a single moment, Mr. Pratt himself. Reverend Hartley stood near the front as well, his face drawn with worry as his daughter walked in beside the very man whose presence had caused such division in his quiet parish. He caught Elinor's eye briefly, a silent plea passing between them, though Elinor only lifted her chin and led Edmund toward two empty seats near the front of the hall. Sir Joseph called the meeting to order with a heavy rap of his cane against the wooden floor, and the murmuring crowd fell into an uneasy silence. "We are gathered this evening," Sir Joseph began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "to discuss a matter of some concern to this parish. It has come to our attention that a gentleman recently settled among us carries with him a history of considerable scandal from London, and reports have reached us suggesting this history extends beyond simple debt into matters of fraud against honest tenant families. Given the safety and good order of this village, we believe it prudent to examine these claims openly, and to determine whether Mr. Edmund Vale ought to be permitted to remain within our parish. A ripple of agreement moved through several rows of the crowd, and Edmund felt Eleanor's hand tighten briefly against the bench beside his own, though she did not reach for him openly, mindful even now of the watching eyes around them. "Mr. Pratt," Sir Joseph continued, turning toward the stranger seated near the front, "you have brought these matters to our attention. Perhaps you would share with the assembly what you know." Mr. Pratt rose smoothly, his expression arranged into careful sorrow as he addressed the crowd. "I regret bringing such unhappy news, good people. I am but a traveling man, with no stake in your parish's affairs. But I have heard, in my travels through several counties, credible accounts of tenant farmers on the Ashcombe estates left destitute by forged agreements bearing this gentleman's own signature. I mention it only out of concern for your safety, for a man capable of such deception in London might easily deceive good, honest folk here as well." Edmund felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, fury and helplessness warring within him as he listened to lies delivered with such convincing sorrow that half the room nodded along in sympathy. He rose slowly to his feet, and the hall fell silent once more, every eye turning toward him with open suspicion. "I would ask Mr. Pratt," Edmund said, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest, "to name even a single tenant family who suffered such harm. A single name, a single farm, a single date. If these accounts are as credible as he claims, surely such details would be readily available." Mr. Pratt's composure faltered only slightly, quickly smoothed over with practiced ease. "I heard these accounts second-hand, sir, from travelers passing through Bristol and beyond. I do not carry a ledger of names with me, only the concern that any honest man would feel upon hearing such troubling reports." "In other words," Edmund said, his voice growing firmer, "you offer this village nothing but rumor without foundation, spoken by a stranger none of you had ever met before this fortnight, and yet you would use it to drive a man from his home without evidence of any kind." A murmur moved through the crowd again, though this time it carried a note of uncertainty rather than agreement, and Edmund pressed forward, sensing the small opening. "I do not deny that scandal follows me," he continued, turning now to address the assembled villagers directly rather than Mr. Pratt alone. "I do not deny that my name has been ruined in London, nor that debts I never took were placed upon my signature through means I do not yet fully understand. But I have lived among you now for nearly a month, and in that time, have I harmed a single soul in this village? Have I taken so much as a loaf of bread without paying for it? Have I threatened, deceived, or wronged any one of you in any way at all?" Silence answered him, broken only by the shifting of feet and the crackling of candles along the walls. "I have not," Edmund continued, his voice steady now, carrying the quiet dignity that had once made him a respected man throughout 3 counties. "Whatever you have heard of my past, whatever this stranger claims to have heard second-hand from travelers he cannot even name, I ask you to judge me instead by what you have seen with your own eyes since I arrived among you." It was then that Eleanor rose beside him, and the hall's attention shifted once more, this time toward the vicar's daughter whose loyalty to the disgraced duke had already become the subject of so much whispered speculation. "I would add," Eleanor said, her voice clear and unwavering despite the flush of color rising in her cheeks, "that I have spent a great deal of time in Mr. Vale's company these past weeks, tending an injury he sustained during a storm, and in all that time I have found him to be honest, gentle, and entirely without the cruelty this village seems so eager to attribute to him based on nothing more than a stranger's unverified word." "Eleanor," her father said quietly from where he stood, his voice carrying a note of gentle warning, though he did not move to silence her. "Forgive me, father," Eleanor said, turning briefly toward him with genuine tenderness in her expression before facing the crowd once more. "But I cannot in good conscience remain silent while this village condemns a man on rumor alone. Is this not the very same parish that gathers each Sunday to hear sermons on charity, on judging not lest we be judged? I have watched this village whisper and turn away from a man in need without once asking him for his own account of events. I have watched a stranger arrive among us, and within a fortnight, Convince half this hall of accusations he cannot even support with a single name or date. I would ask you all, before you decide Mr. Vale's fate this evening, to consider carefully whose word you are truly trusting, and why. A long, uncertain silence followed her words, and Edmund watched as several villagers exchanged uneasy glances, the confident certainty that had filled the hall only minutes before now visibly shaken. Even Mr. Finch, whose disapproval had seemed so absolute at the meeting's start, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly reconsidering the strength of the case against Edmund. Sir Joseph Pemberton studied the room carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured caution of a man accustomed to weighing evidence fairly. "Mr. Pratt," he said, turning toward the stranger, "you have offered this assembly a great deal of concern and very little substance. I am inclined to agree with Mr. Vale that rumor alone, however troubling, does not constitute sufficient grounds to drive a man from his lawful residence within this parish." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the crowd, and Mr. Pratt's carefully composed expression flickered, just for a moment, into something sharper and less patient before he smoothed it over once more. "Of course, Sir Joseph," he said smoothly, "I only sought to inform this good community of what I had heard. I would not presume to dictate their judgment." "Then we shall proceed with proper caution," Sir Joseph continued, addressing the hall at large. "Mr. Vale, you are welcome to remain within this parish, provided no further evidence of wrongdoing comes to light. However, I would encourage you, for the sake of this village's peace and your own, to pursue whatever means necessary to clear your name properly, so that this matter need not trouble our community again." Edmund inclined his head, relief flooding through him even as his mind raced ahead to the letter he had sent to William Carow, still unanswered, still their only hope of finding real proof against Gerald's carefully constructed lies. "Thank you, Sir Joseph. I intend to do exactly that." The meeting dissolved shortly afterward, the crowd dispersing in uneasy clusters, some still whispering doubts, others visibly moved by the honesty Edmund and Eleanor had shown before the assembly. Reverend Hartley approached his daughter as the hall emptied, his expression a complicated mixture of worry and quiet pride. "You spoke bravely tonight, Eleanor," he said softly. "Bravely and perhaps foolishly, given how this village's opinion can shift." "I spoke honestly, Father," Eleanor replied. "I could not have done otherwise and still called myself a woman of conscience." Reverend Hartley studied her for a long moment, then glanced toward Edmund, who stood a respectful distance away, waiting quietly. "I confess I had my doubts about this man when the rumors first reached us. But I have watched you these past weeks, Eleanor, and I have watched him tonight, and I begin to think perhaps my doubts were misplaced." As they walked home together beneath a clear, star-filled sky, the tension of the evening slowly easing from their shoulders, Edmund turned to Eleanor with something like wonder in his expression. "You stood before the entire village and defended me," he said quietly, "knowing full well what it might cost you." "I told you before, Edmund," Eleanor said, using his given name easily now, as though it had always belonged between them. "I do not much care for the cost when I am certain of what is right." He stopped walking, and she stopped beside him, the moonlight catching the quiet steadiness of her expression as she looked up at him. "I do not know how I will ever repay what you have done for me these past weeks," he said softly. "Not merely tonight, but every day since that storm first brought us together." "You need not repay anything," Eleanor said, though her voice had softened, something warmer and more uncertain flickering beneath her usual firmness. "I have not done this out of obligation, Edmund. I have done it because, somewhere along the way, without quite intending to, I came to care a great deal what happens to you." The words hung between them in the cold night air, fragile and unspoken until now, and Edmund felt something in his chest crack open, warmth flooding through the exhaustion and fear that had defined so much of the past month. He reached for her hand, gently, giving her every opportunity to withdraw if she wished, and when she did not, when her fingers curled around his instead, he felt, for the first time since his world had fallen apart in London, that perhaps he had found something worth rebuilding his life around after all. But even as they walked the rest of the way home in comfortable, hopeful silence, Mr. Pratt remained in Millbrook, seated once more at the inn, already composing in his mind the letter he would send to Gerald Vale that very night, informing him that his cousin had survived the village's judgment far more successfully than anticipated, and that stronger measures would be required if Gerald wished to see his cousin's ruin made permanent and complete. William Carrow's reply arrived 9 days later, carried by a rider who had clearly traveled hard to deliver it. Edmund tore open the seal with hands that trembled slightly, Eleanor standing close beside him at the small wooden table as he read the contents aloud. Carrow wrote that he had, upon receiving Edmund's letter, made discreet inquiries with the London solicitors who first uncovered the forged debts. He had been permitted, through an old professional connection, to examine copies of the documents in question, and something in his careful, precise handwriting conveyed genuine excitement beneath the formal legal language. The signatures, Carrow wrote, while remarkably skilled, showed a consistent and telling flaw. Whoever had forged them had clearly practiced from examples of Edmund's signature taken from personal correspondence rather than legal documents, for the pressure and flow of the pen in several letters differed subtly, but measurably from the signatures Edmund had used on his own household ledgers and legal papers over the years. It was not proof that would satisfy a court on its own, Carrow cautioned, but it was a genuine crack in the foundation of the case against him, one that a skilled examination before the proper authorities might widen considerably. Furthermore, Carrow had made careful inquiries into the debts themselves and discovered something troubling. 2 of the 3 creditors who claimed Edmund owed them substantial sums had, in fact, only recently acquired those debts through private purchase from a third party who wished to remain anonymous. Such arrangements were not unheard of in matters of business, Carrow noted, but the timing, occurring mere weeks before the debts were called in publicly and Edmund's ruin made complete, struck him as more than coincidental. "He believes it was arranged," Edmund said slowly, setting the letter down, his heart pounding with something between hope and fury. "Gerald purchased debts that were not truly mine, timed their collection to destroy me publicly, and forged my signature onto papers using samples taken, I would wager, from letters I sent him myself over the years, believing them nothing more than private family correspondence." "Then we have the beginning of proof," Eleanor said, her eyes bright with cautious excitement. "Not enough yet to clear your name entirely, but enough, perhaps, to bring the matter properly before a magistrate with the authority to investigate further." "Carrow suggests exactly that," Edmund said, scanning the remainder of the letter. "He believes the matter ought to be brought before the London courts directly, given the scale of the fraud involved, and offers to represent my interests there himself, without fee, for the sake of our old friendship and his own professional outrage at seeing such deception go unpunished." Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, began to take root in Edmund's chest as he read the letter a second time, searching for any detail he might have missed. For the first time since his ruin began, he could see, however faintly, a path that might lead him back toward the truth being known, toward his name being cleared before all of England rather than simply endured in quiet obscurity. But hope, as Edmund would soon learn, made a poor companion to caution, and Gerald Vale, upon receiving Mr. Pratt's report of the village meeting's disappointing outcome, was not a man inclined to accept defeat quietly. Within a fortnight, new troubles began to gather around Edmund and Eleanor, each seemingly small and disconnected, yet forming, when considered together, a pattern too deliberate to be mere misfortune. First came a visit from a stern-faced debt collector, a man Edmund had never met, claiming that a 4th debt, previously unknown, had come to light against the Ashcombe name. This one supposedly incurred through a private wager Edmund had allegedly made years before the scandal ever broke. The man produced papers bearing what appeared, once again, to be Edmund's own signature, and though Edmund protested vehemently that he had never placed such a wager in his life, the collector remained unmoved, threatening legal action within the month should the debt remain unpaid. Edmund, though shaken, immediately sent a copy of the new claim to William Caro, whose reply arrived within days confirming what Edmund had already suspected. The handwriting bore the same subtle flaws as the earlier forgeries, further strengthening the case that someone was systematically fabricating evidence against him, growing bolder now that his first attempt to drive Edmund from Millbrook through rumor alone had failed. Then came trouble closer to home. Reverend Hartley received an anonymous letter, delivered by an unfamiliar hand, suggesting that his daughter's continued association with a man under such serious suspicion reflected poorly upon his own judgment as spiritual leader of the parish, and hinting, in careful and deniable language, that certain influential families connected to the church's diocese had begun to take notice of the matter with some concern. Reverend Hartley showed the letter to Alina with visible distress, his weathered hands unsteady as he passed it to her across the vicarage table. "I do not know who sends such things, Alina, nor precisely what they hope to accomplish, but I confess this troubles me more than the village gossip ever did. If the diocese itself begins to question my judgment, it is not only my position at risk, but the welfare of this entire parish, which depends upon the church's continued support." Alina read the letter twice, her jaw tightening with each line, recognizing immediately the same careful, deliberate cruelty that had marked every move against Edmund since his ruin began. "This is not concern from the diocese, Father. This is Gerald Vale, or someone acting on his behalf, seeking new ways to isolate Edmund now that Millbrook itself has refused to turn against him entirely. If he cannot drive Edmund out through rumor, he means to drive away everyone who supports him instead. Whether or not that is true," her father said gently, "I must consider the welfare of this parish alongside my own sympathies, Alina. I do not ask you to abandon Mr. Vale. But I would ask you to consider carefully how far you are willing to let this matter carry you, and what it might cost not only yourself, but everyone who depends upon this parish's good standing." Alina left the vicarage that afternoon carrying a weight she had not felt before, the first genuine doubt creeping into her certainty, not about Edmund's character, which she trusted completely, but about the wisdom of continuing to stand so publicly beside him when the forces arrayed against them seemed to grow more numerous and more determined with each passing week. She found Edmund in his garden, attempting, with mixed success, to repair a section of fence that had collapsed sometime during the winter storms, and something in her expression must have betrayed her troubled thoughts, for he set down his tools immediately and crossed to meet her. "What has happened?" he asked, concern sharpening his voice. Alina told him of the letter, of her father's careful warning, and watched as Edmund's expression shifted from concern to something heavier, something that looked almost like resignation. "Then perhaps your father is right to worry," Edmund said quietly, turning away from her to look out over the bare winter fields. "I have brought nothing but trouble to everyone who has shown me kindness since I arrived in this village. Perhaps it would be wiser for you to distance yourself from me, Alina, at least until this matter with Caro reaches some resolution. I could not bear to be the cause of your father losing his position, nor of you losing the respect of the only community you have ever known." Alina felt something fierce and stubborn rise within her at his words, and she stepped forward, forcing him to turn and face her directly. "Do not you dare decide this for me, Edmund Vale. I have made my choice already, and I will not have you take it from me now simply because the cost has grown steeper than either of us anticipated." "I am not trying to take anything from you," Edmund said, frustration and fear roughening his voice. "I am trying to protect you from a man who has already destroyed my entire life without hesitation and without mercy. You have seen what Gerald is capable of, Alina. Forged signatures, purchased debts, anonymous letters designed to threaten your father's livelihood. What do you imagine he might attempt next, should he decide that separating us through threats alone is insufficient?" The question hung in the cold winter air between them, heavier than either had intended, and for a long moment neither spoke, both aware that Gerald's escalating campaign showed no sign of slowing, and every sign of growing more dangerous with each failed attempt. "I will not pretend I am not afraid," Elinor said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier fierceness. "I am afraid, Edmund. Afraid for my father, afraid for what this village might yet decide, afraid, if I am honest, for what a man capable of such deliberate cruelty might do if he grows desperate enough. But I am more afraid of what kind of woman I would become if I allowed that fear to convince me to abandon what I know to be right. I will not leave you to face this alone, whatever it costs. I would ask that you stop trying to make that decision for me." Edmund studied her for a long moment, torn between the fierce protective instinct urging him to push her away for her own safety, and the deeper, quieter certainty that he had never in his life known anyone so entirely without falseness, so unshakable in her convictions despite every reasonable argument for caution. Finally, he reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own. "Then we face it together," he said softly, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks before. "Whatever comes next." They did not have long to wait to discover what Gerald intended next. Barely a week later, a formal notice arrived at Edmund's cottage, delivered by a magistrate's officer from the nearby town of Ellsworth, informing him that a complaint had been lodged against him by an unnamed party, alleging theft of family jewels belonging to the Ashcombe estate, jewels that had apparently gone missing during the final chaotic weeks before his departure from London, and which the complaint suggested Edmund had taken and hidden before fleeing the city under cover of his growing disgrace. Edmund read the notice with a growing sense of disbelief and cold fury, recognizing immediately the same careful hand behind this new accusation, as behind every other misfortune that had befallen him since arriving in Millbrook. "Jewels," he said, showing the notice to Elinor, who had arrived just as the officer departed. "Family jewels I have not so much as seen since my grandmother's death a decade ago, kept always in the estate's private vault, to which only the family solicitor and I ever held keys. Gerald knows precisely where those jewels are, Elinor, because he took possession of the estate's remaining assets after my ruin was made complete. If they have truly gone missing, it is because he has hidden them himself, and now means to place the blame squarely upon me." "This is escalation," Elinor said grimly, reading the notice a second time. "Rumor and forged debts are one matter difficult enough to disprove, but a formal accusation of theft brought before a magistrate is far more dangerous. You could be summoned to answer for it, Edmund, perhaps even taken into custody while the matter is investigated." "Then we must move quickly," Edmund said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "I will write to Caro again immediately, informing him of this new development. If he can bring the matter of the forged signatures before the London courts, before this new accusation gains further ground, perhaps we can demonstrate a clear pattern of deliberate fraud rather than isolated misfortune." Elinor nodded, though worry had settled deeply into her expression, and Edmund could see, watching her, that she understood as clearly as he did that Gerald Vale had shown, through this latest and most serious accusation yet, that he was prepared to pursue his cousin's complete destruction by any means necessary, regardless of the cost to truth, to justice, or to the innocent people who had simply shown Edmund the basic kindness he deserved. That evening, as Edmund composed his urgent letter to Caro by candlelight, Elinor sat across from him at the small wooden table, her own hands busy mending a torn shirt sleeve, though her mind was clearly elsewhere, turning over the growing danger they now faced together. "Edmund," she said quietly, breaking the long silence between them, "if this accusation of theft is not disproven, what becomes of you? What does English law demand of a man convicted of stealing from his own family's estate?" Edmund paused in his writing, his jaw tightening at the question he had been carefully avoiding since the notice first arrived. "Imprisonment, most likely," he said finally, his voice low. "Perhaps transportation, depending upon the severity the courts assign to the theft, given the value of the jewels in question. It would mean the complete and permanent end of whatever remains of the Ashcombe name, and very likely the end of any life I might hope to build here in Millbrook or anywhere else in England." Elinor set down her mending, her face pale in the flickering candlelight. "Then we cannot allow it to reach that point. Whatever it takes, Edmund, We must find proof of Gerald's deception before this accusation is permitted to run its course. Edmund reached across the table and took her hand once more, drawing strength from her steady presence even as fear for both their futures pressed heavily upon his chest. "We will find it," he said, though even as he spoke the words, he was not entirely certain he believed them. "We must." Outside, the winter wind howled against the small cottage's thin walls, and somewhere far away in London, Gerald Vale sat comfortably before his own well-tended fire, reading a fresh report from Mr. Pratt confirming that the theft accusation had been successfully lodged, and allowing himself, for the first time in weeks, a genuine and satisfied smile. The summons arrived exactly 8 days later, delivered this time not by a local officer, but by a formal courier from London bearing the seal of the King's Bench. Edmund was ordered to appear before the magistrate's court in London within a fortnight to answer the charge of theft against the Ashcombe estate, and failure to appear, the document warned in stark and unforgiving language, would result in a warrant being issued for his arrest. Eleanor read the summons twice over his shoulder, her face draining of color. "A fortnight," she said quietly. "That is scarcely enough time to travel to London, let alone gather sufficient proof to answer such a charge." "Caro has been working tirelessly," Edmund said, though the strain in his voice betrayed his own doubts. He wrote only 3 days ago that he had located the solicitor who first drew up the false debt papers and hoped to obtain a sworn statement regarding the handwriting discrepancies. But a sworn statement about forged debts may do little to answer a charge of stolen jewels, unless we can somehow connect the two matters directly before the court. "Then we must go to London ourselves," Eleanor said suddenly, straightening with sudden resolve. "Not merely rely upon letters carried back and forth across the country while the fortnight slips away. If Caro needs further evidence, perhaps we can help him find it directly." "Eleanor, I cannot ask you to travel to London on my behalf," Edmund said immediately. "It is a journey of 2 days at minimum, through country roads still treacherous with winter mud, and your presence there, unmarried and unchaperoned beside a man facing criminal charges, could do irreparable harm to your reputation, far beyond anything Millbrook's gossip has managed to inflict." "You are not asking," Eleanor reminded him, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks before with a small, determined smile that did not quite reach her worried eyes. "And my father has already agreed to accompany us, both as chaperone and, I suspect, because he has grown rather more invested in seeing justice done than he cares to admit." Reverend Hartley, when Edmund questioned him directly that same evening, confirmed Eleanor's claim with a weary but firm nod. "I have watched this campaign against you unfold these past weeks, Mr. Vale, and whatever caution I once urged upon my daughter, I confess I no longer believe caution alone will serve either of you well. A man capable of forging documents and planting false accusations of theft is not a man who will simply lose interest once ignored. I would rather stand beside my daughter in this fight than watch her face it while I remain safely at home, wondering whether my caution cost you both everything." And so, 3 days later, the three of them set out together for London, traveling in a hired carriage through roads still slick with the last of winter's mud. Eleanor's small trunk packed with what few respectable garments she owned, Reverend Hartley carrying with him a Bible and a stack of correspondence he intended to review during the long hours of travel, and Edmund carrying, folded carefully in his coat pocket, every letter Caro had sent him since their correspondence began. Each one a fragile thread of hope against the mounting case being built against him. They arrived in London on a cold, grey afternoon, the city's noise and bustle striking Edmund with an unexpected wave of painful memory, every familiar street corner and grand building a reminder of the life he had once known there, now stripped entirely away. William Caro met them at their modest lodgings that same evening, a tall, serious man with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and Edmund felt a rush of gratitude simply at the sight of a familiar, trustworthy face in a city that had turned so thoroughly against him. "I have made progress," Caro said without preamble, settling into a chair across from them as Eleanor poured tea with steady, careful hands. The solicitor who prepared the original debt documents has agreed, reluctantly, to provide a sworn statement acknowledging that he cannot with certainty verify the authenticity of the signatures, given the subtle inconsistencies I identified in my examination. It is not a full confession of forgery, but it opens the door to reasonable doubt, which is more than we had a fortnight ago. "And the jewels?" Edmund asked, leaning forward. "Have you learned anything of their whereabouts?" Caro's expression grew more guarded. "I have learned something troubling, though I am not yet certain how best to use it. I spoke with a former servant of the Ashcombe estate, a young footman named Thomas who was dismissed shortly after your cousin took possession of the remaining properties. He claims, though he is understandably afraid to speak openly given his current employment depends upon his silence, that he personally observed your cousin removing a small locked case from the estate's private vault only days before the theft accusation was first lodged against you." Edmund felt his pulse quicken. Would he testify to this before the court? "That," Caro said carefully, "is precisely the difficulty. He fears retaliation, both from your cousin directly and from the loss of whatever new position he has managed to secure since his dismissal. I have spoken with him twice now, and each time he grows more hesitant rather than less, clearly weighing the risk of speaking against powerful men versus the safety of remaining silent." Eleanor, who had been listening quietly throughout the conversation, set down her teacup and leaned forward with the same steady determination Edmund had come to recognize as entirely her own. "Might I speak with him myself, Mr. Caro? Sometimes a frightened man finds it easier to trust a stranger with no stake in the powerful families involved, particularly a woman who poses no threat to his livelihood or his safety." Caro considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "It could not hurt to try, Miss Hartley, provided you understand the risk. If word reaches Gerald Vale that his former footman has been speaking with anyone connected to Edmund's defense, the young man's situation could grow considerably more dangerous, regardless of whether he ultimately agrees to testify." "I understand the risk," Eleanor said firmly. "But a frightened young man deserves the chance to be heard fairly, and if there is any possibility he holds the key to proving the truth of this entire terrible business, I would rather try and fail than remain safely idle while Edmund's fate hangs in the balance." The following afternoon, Eleanor and Caro together sought out the young footman Thomas at a modest lodging house in a quieter corner of the city where he had found temporary work as a groundskeeper's assistant. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps no older than 18, with nervous eyes that darted constantly toward the door as though expecting trouble to arrive at any moment. Eleanor approached him with the same gentle, steady patience she had once shown Edmund in the storm, speaking quietly and without pressure, allowing the young man to set the pace of their conversation rather than demanding immediate answers. She spoke of Edmund not as a wronged nobleman seeking to reclaim his standing, but simply as a man who had lost everything through no fault of his own, a man who had shown her nothing but honesty and kindness despite his ruin, and who now faced imprisonment for a crime committed by another. "I do not ask you to risk everything, Thomas," Eleanor said gently, sitting across from him in the small, sparse room. "I only ask whether you might be willing to speak the truth of what you saw in whatever way feels safest to you. A written statement, perhaps, given privately to Mr. Caro, rather than testimony given openly before the court, if that would ease your fears." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands twisting nervously in his lap, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I liked the old Duke well enough, miss. He was always fair with the staff, never cruel like some gentlemen can be. When his cousin took over the house, things changed quickly. Servants let go without proper notice, wages cut, and Lord Gerald himself grew short-tempered with anyone who asked too many questions about how the estate's remaining assets were being managed." "And the case you saw him remove from the vault?" Eleanor asked softly. "I saw it clear as anything, miss," Thomas said, his voice steadying slightly now that he had begun to speak. "A small locked case, the kind used for jewels and fine things. He carried it out himself late one evening when he thought the house was empty. I only saw him because I had come back for my forgotten coat. He did not see me at all. 2 days later, I heard talk among the remaining staff that jewels had gone missing from the estate, and that the blame had somehow fallen upon the old Duke himself, though he had not set foot in that house in weeks by then. Elinor felt her heart leap with cautious hope, though she kept her expression calm and steady for Thomas's sake. "Would you be willing to put what you have told me into a written statement, Thomas? Mr. Caro could arrange for it to be handled with the utmost discretion, and I promise you, whatever comes of it, no harm will come to you through any fault of ours." Thomas hesitated a long moment, fear still visible in his young face, but something in Elinor's steady, patient kindness seemed to ease his doubts, and finally he nodded. "I will do it, miss. It was not right, what happened to the old Duke, and I have carried the guilt of my silence long enough." Elinor returned to their lodgings that evening with news that lifted the heavy weight from Edmund's shoulders for the first time since the summons had arrived. Caro immediately set about drafting the young footman's statement into proper legal language, working long into the night by candlelight while Edmund paced restlessly nearby, torn between hope and the fear that even this evidence might not prove sufficient. "It is a beginning," Caro said finally, setting down his pen well past midnight, exhaustion evident in his lined face. Combined with the solicitor's statement regarding the questionable signatures, and Thomas's account of witnessing your cousin removing the jewels himself, we have the foundation of a genuine case, not merely a defense against the accusations leveled at you, but grounds to bring formal charges against Gerald Vale himself. "Will it be enough?" Edmund asked quietly, the question that had haunted him for weeks finally spoken aloud. Caro was honest with him, as he had always been. "I do not know, Edmund. Your cousin is a wealthy and well-connected man, and such men do not fall easily, even when the evidence against them grows compelling. But it is far more than we had even a week ago, and I intend to present every piece of it before the court with everything I have." The hearing was set for 3 days hence, and those 3 days passed in a blur of careful preparation, Caro reviewing every document and statement with meticulous care, Elinor offering steady support and clear-headed insight whenever doubt threatened to overwhelm either of the two men working so desperately to save Edmund's future. Reverend Hartley spent long hours in quiet prayer, and though he said little of his own fears, Edmund noticed the older man's hands trembled slightly each time he closed his Bible, a small betrayal of the anxiety he carried on their behalf. On the evening before the hearing, Edmund found himself alone with Elinor in the small sitting room of their lodgings. The candles burned low, the house quiet around them. He had spent the better part of an hour staring into the fire, saying little, his mind turning over every possible outcome the following day might bring. "You are frightened," Elinor observed gently, settling into the chair beside him. "I am," Edmund admitted, the honesty coming easier now than it once had, worn smooth by weeks of her steady presence. "Not merely for myself, Elinor, though I confess the thought of imprisonment or worse weighs heavily upon me. I am frightened of what becomes of you, of your father, of everything you have both risked on my behalf, should tomorrow's hearing fail to clear my name." Elinor reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady around his own. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Edmund, I do not regret a single choice that brought us to this moment. Not the storm, not the village's cruelty, not this long and difficult journey to London. I would make every one of those choices again, knowing everything I know now." Edmund turned to look at her fully then, the firelight casting soft shadows across her face, and something in his chest, some final wall he had held carefully in place since the disaster first stripped away everything he thought he knew about his own life, finally began to crumble entirely. "I love you," he said quietly, the words rising unbidden from somewhere deep and honest within him, spoken before he had fully decided to speak them at all. "I do not know what tomorrow holds, Elinor, nor whether I will have anything left to offer you should the hearing go against me. But I could not face tomorrow without you knowing the truth of what has grown in my heart these past weeks." Elinor's breath caught, and for a long moment she simply looked at him, something bright and unguarded shining in her eyes. "I love you as well, Edmund Vale," she said softly. "I have known it for some weeks now, though I confess I was too frightened of what it might mean to speak it aloud." They sat together in comfortable, aching silence after that, hands joined, the weight of tomorrow's uncertain hearing pressing upon them both, yet somehow made lighter by the truth finally spoken between them. Neither of them slept much that night, each aware that come morning, everything they had fought for these past weeks would finally be laid bare before the harsh judgment of London's court, with no certainty at all of what verdict awaited them on the other side. The courtroom at Westminster was colder and grander than anything Edmund had faced in Millbrook's small church hall, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling, designed to remind every man who entered of the weight and permanence of the law. Edmund stood before the magistrate's bench that morning in his best remaining coat, carefully brushed and pressed despite its age, Eleanor and her father seated in the small gallery behind him, and William Carow standing at his side, a leather folder of carefully prepared documents held firmly in his hands. Gerald Vale arrived shortly after, dressed in fine dark clothing that spoke of continued wealth and comfort, his expression composed into a careful mask of solemn concern as he took his place across the courtroom, flanked by his own well-paid legal counsel. He glanced once toward Edmund, and for just a moment, something cold and calculating flickered behind his carefully arranged sorrow before he looked away, addressing the magistrate instead with practiced deference. The magistrate, an elderly man named Sir Reginald Ashford, called the court to order with brisk efficiency, and the formal proceedings began, the clerk reading aloud the charges against Edmund in flat, official language that made the accusation sound all the more damning stripped of any context or explanation. Gerald's counsel spoke first, presenting the theft accusation with smooth confidence, describing the missing jewels, their considerable value, and the circumstances suggesting Edmund had removed them during the final chaotic days before his departure from London. He spoke, too, of the earlier debts, weaving them together into a picture of a desperate man willing to deceive and steal to preserve some remnant of his former comfort, and Edmund felt the weight of the courtroom's attention settle upon him like a physical burden as the counsel's careful narrative unfolded. When it came time for Carow to present Edmund's defense, he rose with the same quiet, methodical confidence Edmund remembered from their years together at Cambridge, laying out first the solicitor's sworn statement regarding the questionable authenticity of the original debt signatures, explaining in careful, measured language the subtle inconsistencies that suggested forgery rather than genuine authorship. Gerald's counsel objected immediately, arguing that a single solicitor's uncertainty proved nothing conclusive, and Sir Reginald allowed the objection to stand, though his expression suggested the argument had at least planted a seed of doubt in his careful judicial mind. It was when Carow introduced Thomas's written statement that the courtroom's atmosphere shifted noticeably. He read the young footman's account aloud, describing in careful detail the evening Thomas had witnessed Gerald Vale removing a small locked case from the estate's private vault, mere days before the theft accusation against Edmund was first lodged. Gerald's composed expression cracked just slightly at the mention of the footman's name, and Edmund, watching closely, saw his cousin's eyes dart briefly toward his counsel with something that looked, for the first time, like genuine alarm. "This is nothing more than the word of a dismissed servant, likely bitter over his loss of employment," Gerald's counsel argued, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "Surely the court cannot give credence to such an unsubstantiated claim." "The young man risked his current employment and his safety to provide this statement," Carow replied evenly, asking nothing in return beyond the opportunity to see the truth known. "I would ask the court to consider what motive he might possibly have to fabricate such an account, beyond a simple desire to see justice properly served." Sir Reginald studied the statement for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable, before he set it aside and addressed Gerald directly, his voice carrying the careful authority of a man well accustomed to weighing conflicting accounts. "Lord Gerald Vale, can you account for your whereabouts and actions on the evening in question, as described in this statement?" Gerald hesitated just for a moment, a hesitation so brief that most in the courtroom might have missed it entirely. But Edmund, who had known his cousin his entire life, recognized it immediately for what it was. The first true crack in Gerald's carefully constructed composure. "I do not recall the specific evening in question with any precision, Your Honor," Gerald said carefully. "I visited the estate's vault on several occasions during that period, in my capacity as the family's remaining representative, to properly catalog and secure the assets left in disarray following my cousin's disgrace." "And did this cataloging include removing items from the estate to locations outside the family's official records?" Sir Reginald pressed. "Certainly not with any intention of impropriety," Gerald said, though sweat had begun to bead faintly at his temple despite the courtroom's cool air. "Any items moved were done so entirely for their proper safekeeping, given the chaotic circumstances of the estate's management at that time." It was at this precise moment, as Gerald's careful answers began to fray at their edges under the court's persistent questioning, that Caro played what proved to be the decisive card in Edmund's defense. He produced a final document, one that had arrived only that very morning, delivered by special courier from Bristol, and requested permission to enter it into evidence. It was a sworn statement from a jeweler in Bristol, a man Caro had located through careful inquiry over the preceding days, confirming that he had, some 3 weeks earlier, been approached by a gentleman matching Gerald Vale's precise description, seeking to privately sell a small collection of fine jewels matching, in detail and description, the very pieces reported stolen from the Ashcombe estate. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Caro read the statement aloud, and Edmund watched, with a mixture of vindication and something close to sorrow, as his cousin's face drained of color entirely, the careful mask of composed innocence finally, completely shattering before the assembled court. "This is absurd," Gerald said, his voice rising for the first time, sharp with genuine panic rather than practiced sorrow. "This jeweler is mistaken, or has been paid to fabricate such an account entirely. I demand to know who arranged this obvious deception against me." "The jeweler," Caro said calmly, "identified you from a portrait provided by Mr. Vale's solicitor, a portrait taken some years ago at your own family's request, and confirmed the transaction independently through his own carefully maintained business ledgers, which I would be happy to submit to this court for further examination should Your Honor require it." Sir Reginald studied the statement for a long, weighted moment, then looked up, his expression grave as he addressed the courtroom at large. "It appears to this court that what began as a straightforward matter of alleged theft has revealed itself to be something considerably more troubling. I am inclined to believe, based on the evidence presented today, that the true circumstances of this case differ substantially from those originally presented." The proceedings that followed moved quickly once the truth began to unravel in earnest. Gerald's counsel, sensing the case slipping entirely beyond salvage, requested a recess to confer privately with his client, and when the court reconvened an hour later, Gerald's composure had crumbled entirely, replaced by the desperate, cornered expression of a man who understood, finally, that his careful scheme had been exposed beyond any hope of recovery. Under continued questioning, and faced with the mounting weight of evidence against him, Gerald's story began to fracture further, contradictions emerging with each answer he gave, until finally, with visible reluctance and barely restrained fury, he admitted to arranging the sale of the family jewels himself, though he continued to insist, even then, that the forged debts and signatures were matters entirely beyond his knowledge or involvement. Sir Reginald did not seem inclined to believe this final claim, and ordered a full formal investigation into the matter of the forged documents to proceed separately, with Gerald Vale named as the primary suspect in both the theft and the fraudulent debts that had so thoroughly destroyed his cousin's reputation and standing. As for Edmund, the magistrate's ruling, when it finally came, brought a wave of relief so profound that Edmund's legs nearly failed beneath him as he stood to hear it. "Given the evidence presented before this court," Sir Reginald announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, I find no credible basis upon which to sustain the charges brought against Edmund Vale. The theft accusation is hereby dismissed entirely, and I further direct that the matter of the earlier debts be reopened for full investigation, with the strong suggestion, based on today's proceedings, that Mr. Vale's original ruin was the product of deliberate and calculated fraud rather than any wrongdoing of his own. The courtroom erupted into murmured conversation, and Edmund felt Eleanor's hand find his own from where she had risen in the gallery, her eyes bright with tears of relief and joy she made no effort to hide. Reverend Hartley, beside her, offered a quiet prayer of thanks, his weathered face creased with genuine emotion. Gerald was led from the courtroom under formal escort, his fine dark clothing suddenly seeming to hang loosely upon him, his composed mask gone entirely, replaced by the hollow, defeated expression of a man watching his own carefully constructed world collapse as thoroughly and completely as he had once caused Edmund's to fall apart. It was outside the courtroom, on the wide stone steps of Westminster, beneath a pale winter sun finally breaking through weeks of gray clouds, that Edmund turned to Eleanor, his heart overflowing with a gratitude too vast to contain within ordinary words of thanks. He did not plan the gesture, nor did he consider in that moment how it might appear to the small crowd of onlookers still lingering near the courthouse steps, curious about the dramatic proceedings that had just concluded within. He simply felt, with an overwhelming and undeniable certainty, that words alone could never sufficiently express what this woman had given him, not merely her loyalty through weeks of danger and uncertainty, but her unwavering belief in his character when the entire world, London and Millbrook alike, had been so quick to condemn him without a single moment's fair consideration. Edmund Vale, once Duke of Ashcombe, a man who had stood proudly before kings and courtiers without ever once bending his knee to another living soul beyond his own sovereign, sank slowly down onto one knee before Eleanor Hartley, there upon the cold stone steps of Westminster, in full view of the gathering crowd, his eyes never once leaving her startled, luminous face. "I do not kneel before you as a duke to a common woman, Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the sudden hush that had fallen over those nearby who had paused to watch. "I kneel before you as simply a man, stripped of every title and every fortune I once believed defined my worth, humbled entirely by the extraordinary compassion you showed me when I had absolutely nothing left to offer you in return. You knelt beside me once in the mud of a storm, when the whole of England had turned away, and asked for nothing beyond the chance to help a stranger in need. I kneel before you now, not to ask anything further of your kindness, but simply because you deserve, at long last, to see exactly how deeply and completely that kindness changed the entire course of my life." Eleanor stood frozen for a long moment, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, her hand pressed to her mouth as the weight of his words settled over her, before she sank down as well, kneeling there beside him upon the cold stone steps, entirely heedless of the small crowd watching, entirely heedless of anything beyond the man before her whose heart she had somehow, without ever intending it, come to hold so completely within her own. "You owe me no debt, Edmund," she whispered, her hands finding his own. "Whatever compassion I showed you, you have returned it tenfold, simply by allowing me to see the truth of your character when the whole world insisted upon believing otherwise. I did not save you that day in the storm expecting anything in return. I only hoped, in whatever small way I could manage, to remind one broken man that he was not entirely alone in the world." "You did far more than remind me of that," Edmund said softly, his own eyes bright with emotion he no longer felt any need to hide. "You gave me reason to believe it might be true again." The small crowd gathered near the courthouse steps watched in respectful, hushed silence as the two of them remained there together, kneeling upon the cold stone, the pale winter sun breaking fully through the clouds above them at last. And somewhere in that quiet, unguarded moment, both Edmund Vale and Eleanor Hartley understood, without need for further words, that whatever trials still lay ahead, they would face every one of them together, bound now by something far stronger than the scandal, the gossip, or the cruelty that had once tried so desperately to keep them apart. The weeks that followed the hearing passed in a strange, disorienting blend of relief and continued uncertainty. As the formal investigation into Gerald Vale's fraud unfolded slowly through London's legal channels, Caro visited them often at their lodgings, bringing news of each new discovery as investigators uncovered the full extent of Gerald's deception. A carefully constructed scheme that had taken shape over nearly a year, beginning long before the public scandal ever broke. It emerged that Gerald had first begun collecting samples of Edmund's handwriting from old family correspondence more than a year earlier, patiently practicing the forgery of his cousin's signature until he could replicate it with startling accuracy. He had quietly purchased debts belonging to Edmund's name from creditors willing to sell them at a discount, understanding that once called in publicly and simultaneously, they would appear overwhelming and impossible to dispute. He had timed the entire scheme to coincide with a period when Edmund's own solicitor had been recovering from a lengthy illness, relying on a junior associate less familiar with Edmund's true financial affairs to unknowingly confirm the fraudulent debts as genuine. The theft of the family jewels, it turned out, had been a matter of simple opportunistic greed once the larger scheme succeeded beyond even Gerald's own expectations. A final attempt to extract whatever remaining value he could from the estate before the truth risked coming to light. Gerald was formally charged with fraud, forgery, and theft, and though the legal proceedings would take many more months to reach their final conclusion, the evidence against him had grown so overwhelming by the time formal charges were filed that even his own expensive legal counsel privately advised him to expect little mercy from the court. For Edmund, the formal restoration of his name and title, once the investigation's findings were made public, arrived with a strange and complicated mixture of emotions he had not fully anticipated. The very same society that had turned away from him so completely during his disgrace now moved with equal speed to welcome him back. Letters of apology and renewed friendship arriving daily from men and women who had once refused even to acknowledge his existence. He found he could not entirely forgive the ease with which they had first condemned him, and now sought to embrace him again, though he accepted their overtures with polite reserve rather than open bitterness, understanding that holding onto resentment would serve no purpose beyond poisoning whatever peace he had finally managed to reclaim. The Ashcombe estate itself, though considerably diminished by the costs of Gerald's scheme and the legal proceedings required to unravel it, remained largely intact, and Edmund found himself once again a man of considerable, if reduced, means. Yet when the time came to decide what to do with this restored fortune, he found his thoughts turning again and again not toward the grand London townhouse he might have reclaimed, nor the fashionable society he had once moved through so easily, but toward the small, crooked cottage in Millbrook, and the quiet, honest life he had begun to build there before everything else had been so violently interrupted. "I do not wish to return to London permanently," he told Eleanor one evening, as they sat together in the modest sitting room of their lodgings, the last of the legal proceedings finally drawing toward their close. "I have spent these past months learning what truly matters in a life, and I find I have very little desire to return to drawing rooms filled with people who judge a man's worth by his title and his fortune alone." "Where would you go instead?" Eleanor asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "Millbrook," Edmund said simply. "I would restore the old cottage properly, perhaps purchase some additional land to farm honestly and build a quiet life there, among people who, whatever their initial doubts, ultimately judged me by my true character rather than by rumor alone. But I would not wish to build that life without you beside me, Eleanor, if you would have me." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears for perhaps the 100th time since their journey to London had begun, though these tears carried none of the fear or grief of the weeks before, only pure, overwhelming joy. "I have known since that very first storm, Edmund, that wherever you chose to build your life, I wished to build mine there as well beside you." They were married that spring, in the very same small church in Millbrook, where the village elders had once gathered to debate whether Edmund deserved to remain among them at all. The ceremony was modest by the standards of Edmund's former life, But the church overflowed with villagers who had, in the months since the truth of Gerald's scheme became widely known, come to regard both Edmund and Alina with genuine warmth and respect, many of them quietly ashamed of how quickly they had once turned against a man who had done nothing to deserve their suspicion. Mrs. Winslow, who had once been among the loudest voices spreading doubt about Alina's judgment, brought a beautifully embroidered handkerchief as a wedding gift, her eyes damp with tears as she embraced Alina warmly outside the church. Walter Cobb the baker, who had once refused Edmund's service, presented them with an elaborately decorated wedding cake, refusing any payment despite Edmund's insistence, calling it a small penance for his earlier unkindness. Even Sir Joseph Pemberton, the stern magistrate who had presided over Millbrook's uncertain judgment that difficult evening, attended the wedding, offering his sincere congratulations and expressing quiet admiration for the courage both Edmund and Alina had shown throughout their long ordeal. Reverend Hartley performed the ceremony himself, his voice thick with emotion as he pronounced his own daughter married to the man he had once viewed with such careful, worried caution, and had come, over the months that followed, to regard with genuine affection and respect. The old Vale cottage, restored over the following months with the careful attention of skilled local craftsmen, grew from its crumbling, neglected state into a modest but comfortable home, its garden replanted, its roof properly repaired, its once empty rooms slowly filled with the warmth and life that had been so entirely absent when Edmund first arrived there alone and broken. Edmund purchased additional farmland surrounding the cottage, and rather than managing it from a comfortable distance as a great landowner might have done, he threw himself into the work directly, learning alongside the tenant farmers he employed, earning their genuine respect through honest labor rather than the empty authority of an inherited title. He hired Henry Bolton, the village blacksmith who had been among the first to offer him quiet, unspoken support during the darkest weeks of his disgrace, to help manage the estate's practical affairs, and the two men grew into close and genuine friends over the seasons that followed. Alina, for her part, continued her work assisting her father throughout the parish, tending to the sick, comforting the grieving, and offering practical wisdom to young couples navigating their own difficult beginnings. Her reputation in Millbrook transformed entirely from a subject of scandalous whisper into one of genuine and widespread respect and affection. Word of the Duke of Ashcombe's restoration, and of the remarkable circumstances surrounding it, spread eventually beyond Millbrook and even beyond London, becoming, in time, something of a celebrated tale among those who valued stories of genuine loyalty triumphing over cruelty and deception. Edmund and Alina, however, found themselves largely indifferent to their growing notoriety, far more content with the quiet satisfaction of the life they had built together than with any renewed social standing their story might have earned them. As for Gerald Vale, his trial concluded some 8 months after the initial hearing that had first exposed his deception. The mounting evidence against him, including further testimony from additional servants who came forward once Thomas's initial courage, demonstrated that speaking the truth need not end in ruin, proving overwhelming and impossible to dispute. He was stripped of whatever remaining claim he held to the Ashcombe name and properties, and sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment for his crimes, a fate that, whatever satisfaction Edmund might once have imagined feeling upon hearing it, arrived instead with a quiet, complicated sadness, the recognition that a man who had once been family, however distant and however cruel his eventual betrayal, had thrown away his own life so completely in pursuit of a fortune and title that had never truly belonged to him. Edmund visited his cousin only once, before the final sentencing, seeking not vengeance nor cruel satisfaction, but some small measure of understanding as to how a man could turn so entirely against his own blood. Gerald, stripped of his fine clothing and confident bearing, seated in a plain cell, offered no genuine remorse, only bitter resentment that his careful scheme had ultimately failed. "You were always the favored one," he said coldly, refusing to meet Edmund's eyes. "The title, the fortune, the easy respect of everyone around you, simply handed to you by accident of birth, while I was left to scrape by on the family's leavings. I only sought to take what should rightfully have been mine. Edmund studied his cousin for a long moment, feeling not the anger he might once have expected, but only a quiet, weary sorrow. Whatever unfairness you believed existed between us, Gerald, nothing could ever justify what you chose to do. I hope in whatever years remain to you, you find some measure of peace beyond the bitterness that has clearly consumed you. I bear you no further ill will, but I cannot pretend to feel anything close to forgiveness either, not yet, and perhaps not ever. He left the prison that day and did not return again, choosing instead to focus entirely on the life he and Alina were building together. A life defined not by the shadow of his cousin's betrayal, but by the genuine warmth, honesty, and quiet joy they had found in one another despite everything that had once conspired to keep them apart. As the seasons turned and the cottage garden bloomed fully for the first time in many years, Edmund often found himself thinking back to that cold, muddy storm that had first brought Alina kneeling beside him on the empty road, and marveling at how entirely his life had transformed from that single moment of unexpected compassion. He had lost everything he once believed defined his worth as a man: his title, his fortune, his standing among London's fashionable society, and had discovered, in the wreckage of that loss, something far more valuable than any of it had ever truly been. He had discovered a woman whose loyalty and courage never wavered, even when every reasonable argument suggested she abandon him to save herself. He had discovered a village capable, ultimately, of setting aside its own cruel assumptions when confronted with honest evidence and genuine character. And he had discovered, most importantly of all, that his own worth had never truly depended upon the title he had lost, but upon the choices he made and the character he maintained even in the depths of his darkest and most desperate hours. Alina, watching him from the cottage doorway one warm spring evening as he walked the fields with Henry Bolton, discussing plans for the coming harvest, felt her own heart swell with a quiet, contented happiness she had never once regretted choosing, whatever the cost had seemed at the time. She thought often in these peaceful moments of her father's careful warning on that very first evening, his gentle caution about the price a woman might pay for standing apart from her community's expectations, and she understood now, with the clarity that only time and experience could provide, that some prices were worth paying entirely, that some choices, however difficult in the moment, led ultimately toward a life far richer and more meaningful than caution alone could ever have provided. The disgraced Duke of Ashcombe, once mocked and abandoned by all of London, had found in the end that true nobility had never resided in a title at all, but in the quiet, steadfast compassion of a single vicar's daughter who had knelt beside him in the mud when the whole of England had turned away, and before whom he had, in turn, gladly and gratefully knelt himself, upon the cold stone steps of Westminster, in the fullness of his own restored and humbled heart. 5 years passed, and Millbrook had changed in ways few could have imagined during those difficult winter months, when a ruined stranger first arrived at the old Vale cottage with nothing but a leaking roof and a broken reputation to his name. The village had grown steadily more prosperous under Edmund's careful management of the surrounding farmland, new cottages built for tenant families who had once struggled through harsh winters with too little grain to see them through, a proper schoolhouse constructed at Alina's gentle but persistent urging, where the children of farmers and shopkeepers alike learned their letters alongside sums and simple history. Edmund and Alina's own home had filled with the sounds of laughter and small, hurrying footsteps, 2 children now, a boy named Charles, who had inherited his father's steady, thoughtful manner, and a younger daughter named Margaret, who possessed her mother's fierce determination in full and sometimes exhausting measure. Edmund often remarked, with quiet amusement, that watching his young daughter argue her case for an extra hour before bedtime reminded him powerfully of the very first conversation he had ever shared with her mother, all those years before in a storm-battered barn. Thomas, the young footman whose courage had proven so crucial to exposing Gerald's deception, had never returned to service in London, choosing instead, at Edmund's quiet insistence and generous offer, to settle in Millbrook, where he now managed the estate's growing farmland alongside Henry Bolton, the two men having become close friends over the years, their shared history bound together by the difficult months when speaking the truth had required such considerable courage from them both. Thomas had married a young woman from the neighboring parish the previous autumn, and Edmund and Alina had attended the wedding with genuine warmth, watching the once frightened young footman stand tall and confident before his own new family, a transformation neither of them ever took for granted. William Carow visited often from Bristol, his own legal practice having grown considerably in reputation following the widely discussed success of Edmund's case, and he had become, over the years, not merely a trusted friend, but something close to an honorary member of the growing family that gathered each summer in the cottage's now flourishing garden. He brought with him, on each visit, news from London of Gerald Vale's continued imprisonment, though such conversations grew steadily shorter and less frequent as the years passed, the bitterness of that betrayal softening gradually into something more like distant, weary sorrow than active pain. It was during the 6th summer of their marriage that Millbrook faced a trial of an entirely different kind, one that tested not the loyalty between two people, but the character of the entire community that had grown, slowly and imperfectly, into something better than the fearful, gossiping village it had once been. A fever swept through the parish that August, arriving first among the children at the new schoolhouse, before spreading quickly through several households in the village proper. Fear, the same kind of fear that had once driven Millbrook to whisper so cruelly against a stranger they did not understand, threatened once again to divide the community, as frightened families began to withdraw from one another, avoiding the sick and their families, some even suggesting the schoolhouse itself be closed permanently rather than risk further contagion. Alina, who had spent years assisting her father throughout the parish, and had, in that time, learned a great deal of practical medicine from the traveling physicians who occasionally passed through Millbrook, refused to allow fear to win the day as it so nearly had once before. She organized the village women into careful shifts, tending to the sick with proper precautions rather than abandoning them entirely, and Edmund, drawing upon the resources his restored fortune provided, sent immediately to Bristol for a physician of genuine skill and experience, covering the full cost himself without a moment's hesitation. We cannot allow this village to fracture out of fear the way it nearly fractured once before, Alina told her husband late one evening, as they sat together reviewing which households required the most urgent assistance. I remember too well what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that fear, Edmund, and I will not stand by and watch it happen to anyone else while there is anything within my power to prevent it. Edmund, watching his wife organize the village's response with the same steady, fearless compassion she had once shown him alone in a storm, felt a familiar swell of admiration and love that had never once dimmed across their years together. "You have never needed my permission for such things," he said softly, echoing words spoken so long ago between them, "but you have always had my full support, whatever you choose to do." Together, they moved through the difficult weeks that followed, Alina tending the sick alongside the Bristol physician, Edmund ensuring every family, regardless of their ability to pay, received whatever medicine and provisions they required, and Reverend Hartley, though grown considerably older and more frail with the passing years, continued offering quiet spiritual comfort to frightened families throughout the parish. Slowly, through careful effort and genuine communal cooperation, rather than the fearful isolation that had once threatened to take hold, the fever passed through Millbrook without claiming a single life, a outcome the village's older residents openly credited to Alina's tireless organization and Edmund's generous, unhesitating support. It was, in its own quiet way, a final and complete transformation of the community that had once so readily condemned a stranger without evidence, now proving itself capable of facing genuine hardship with unity, compassion, and courage, rather than the fear and suspicion that had defined its earlier, more difficult chapter. That autumn, as the harvest came in richer than it had in many years, Millbrook held its traditional celebration in the fields behind the church, and Edmund found himself standing beside Alina as the entire village gathered beneath the golden evening light, sharing food, music, and the particular warmth that comes only from a community that has weathered genuine difficulty together and emerged stronger for the experience. Sir Joseph Pemberton, now grown considerably older himself, approached them during the celebration, leaning heavily on his cane, and offered a small, thoughtful smile as he looked out over the gathered crowd. "I have served as magistrate in this parish for nearly 30 years, he said quietly, "and I confess I have rarely seen a community transform itself so thoroughly as this one has, in the years since you first came among us, Mr. Vale. I do not believe it happened by accident." Edmund considered the old magistrate's words carefully before answering, his eyes finding Alina across the celebration, where she knelt laughing beside their daughter Margaret, helping the little girl gather wildflowers from the field's edge. "I believe, Sir Joseph, that most genuine change begins with a single small act of compassion, offered freely and without expectation of reward. I was fortunate enough, in my darkest hour, to receive exactly such an act from a woman who owed me nothing at all. I have simply tried, in whatever small ways I could manage, to see that same kindness extended more widely throughout the community that eventually became my home." Sir Joseph nodded slowly, watching Alina and Margaret with a warm, approving expression. "Whatever the reason, Millbrook is fortunate to count you both among its people. I do not think this village will soon forget the lesson it learned that difficult winter, nor the debt of gratitude it owes to the woman who first refused to let fear and rumor decide a man's fate without proper evidence." As evening deepened into the soft purple light of early autumn dusk, and the celebration continued around them with music and laughter, and the easy warmth of a community genuinely at peace with itself, Edmund found a quiet moment to walk with Alina along the edge of the harvested field, their children safely occupied with the other village families nearby. "Do you ever think back to that storm?" Alina asked, slipping her hand into his as they walked, the same simple, easy gesture that had grown so natural between them across the years. "Every single day," Edmund admitted, smiling softly at the memory that had once seemed like nothing more than a moment of desperate misfortune, and had proven in time to be the single most important turning point of his entire life. "I think of how easily you might have walked past me that day, how reasonable it would have been for you to leave a stranger to his own misfortune, rather than risk yourself for someone the whole village had already decided to despise." "I could never have walked past," Alina said simply, the same quiet certainty in her voice that had first drawn Edmund to her all those years before, unchanged despite everything that had happened between that muddy road and this golden autumn evening. "It was never truly a choice at all, Edmund. It was simply who I have always tried to be." Edmund stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the golden evening light catching the same warm brown eyes that had first looked upon him with compassion rather than judgment in a barn battered by storm and rain. "Then I consider myself, above all the fortunes and titles I have ever held or lost, the most fortunate man in all of England, simply for having found the one woman capable of such compassion in the very moment I needed it most." Alina smiled, the same steady, unwavering smile that had carried them both through scandal, danger, and every difficulty England's cruelty had once thrown against them. And together they walked back toward the celebration, toward the community they had helped rebuild, toward the children who would grow up knowing a village defined not by fear and suspicion, but by the quiet, enduring power of genuine kindness freely given, and by a love that had begun in a storm and had, in the years since, grown steady and unshakable as the very ground beneath their feet.